Hello guys, in this video we're going to see what the differences between Promise.all settled and Promise.all are. First of all, I have here a variable called promises, which has a value, or which actually has an array of promises. We have three different promises in that array. The first one resolves 1, the second one resolves 2, and the third one resolves 3. I also have two different functions here, test with all settled, in which we're going to see Promise.all settled, and the second function, test with all, in which we're going to use Promise.all. Looking at this, we can see that both methods, all settled and all, both took the same promises variable, which is an array of promises. Also, to make sure of that, we can place the cursor on all settled, and we can see parameter values, it takes an array of promises, and it's the same thing for the all method. The parameters are also an array of promises. What I've also done is I'm logging whatever result we're getting from the promise resulting in Promise.all and the promise response resulting from Promise.all settled. Because also, as we can see, if we place the cursor here, it returns a new promise. And here as well, for all, it also returns a new promise. I'm gonna go ahead and call those two different functions, and let's see the differences. From the first look, we can see that Promise.all settled returned an array of objects, and Promise.all returned an array of values. If we take a closer look to the promises that we have here in our promise array, we can see that the first one resolves into 1, the second one into 2, the third one resolves 3, and those are the exact same values that we have here in Promise.all. So it's safe to say that the promise returned when calling Promise.all, okay, the promise returned in that is going to be an array of values, and those values are the results resolved in every single promise of the promise array that we passed in to the function. On the other hand, Promise.all settled returned an object, an array of objects actually, and each single one of those objects indicate one of the promises that were passed to that method, all settled. So the first one, for example, we can see, of course, we have two different fields here, status and value. The value field is the same as we can see here in Promise.all. It indicates the results that were resolved from every single promise of those. And then we have the status saying whether the promise was fulfilled or rejected. Fulfilled meaning it resolved, it was successful. And that's what we have so far, because all of our promises resolved. So the first key importance, or the first key difference between Promise.all and Promise.all settled is the response returned from those two, or the promise resolved. In Promise.all settled is going to resolve into an array of objects, and Promise.all is going to resolve into an array of results from the promises. Now, to be able to identify a second difference between those two different methods, I change the second promise from the array so that it rejects instead of resolving, and the message is going to be server down. Let's go ahead and run that. I also noticed I made no changes in my two different functions. Let's run that. Okay. Now let's take a look at Promise.all settled first of all. As we can see, just like we said previously, it returned an array of objects. And here, if you take a look, those are the three different objects, each indicating a promise. The second one, we can see status rejected instead of fulfilled, and we can see a reason instead of a value. So far, we've seen that Promise.all settled returns an array of objects, and those objects return two different fields, which are status and value, or status and reason, depending whether or not a status was fulfilled or whether or not a promise was fulfilled, aka resolved, or if it was rejected. In that case, it would show a reason instead of a value. So we can see that whether all the promises were fulfilled or not, we still receive the same response that we usually receive in Promise.all settled. In Promise.all settled. On the other hand, in Promise.all, we can see that we threw an error. The app crashed and there was a non-handled rejection. Let's go ahead and fix that quickly. I'm gonna put a try catch block here. So in case we catch an error, I'm just gonna say server error dots. Then we're gonna move this to the try block. Let's go ahead and save this again. As we can see, we still have the same response from Promise.all.settled, and this time in Promise.all we caught the error here, which is why it showed server error. So we can see a big difference here. We can see that in Promise.all, if any of the promises in the promise array passed to the method all is rejected, the whole promise is rejected, which is why here Promise.all had an error and we had to catch it. So all of it was rejected. On the other hand, in Promise.all.settled, even though not all of the 3 promises passed, in this case it's 3, it could be more or less, even though not all of them were resolved, even though we had one that rejected, we still had a response. We still returned the array of objects that we have seen in the first example. Also note that even if all the promises failed, even if all of them rejected, let's run that again. In Promise.all.settled, we still got that same response. The promise returned still resolved into an array of objects, an array containing the results of each promise, describing whether the promise itself was rejected or not. The 3 different promises that we had here were all rejected, so they all have a reason and not a value, which showed the reason of the rejection. And on the other hand, of course, Promise.all rejected because one or more of the promises passed as an argument rejected. Which is safe to say, which brings us to the definitions or the main difference between those two. Promise.all waits for all the promises to resolve before returning their respective responses. However, and as we have seen in this example and the previous example, that if any of the promises is rejected, then the whole promise is rejected. On the other hand, just like we've seen with Promise.all.settled, it will never reject. So we are always getting a response here. We're always returning something here. It will never reject. It will resolve once all promises in the array have either rejected or resolved. In this case, all of them rejected, but that doesn't matter because once all these promises either rejected or resolved, we got our response here. You can also see different or similar definitions or descriptions here when you put the cursor on it. All.settled creates a promise that is resolved with an array of results when all of the provided promises resolve or reject. And Promise.all, if you put the cursor on it, it creates a promise that is resolved with an array of results when all the provided promises resolve, or it's rejected when any promise is rejected. I didn't want to show you that definition first before showing you the example because it would look intimidating. So I just wanted to show you the example, then give you my definition, and then read whatever was provided in VS Code. You might be asking yourself, when should you use Promise.all in real scenarios? Well, let's say you have a certain response that you want to return, and this response is depending on different API calls or asynchronous functions, and that response depends on every single one of those returned promises or returned API calls. And if one of them fails, then the response wouldn't make sense. In that case, you either want it all to succeed or you're gonna return an error. In that case, you use Promise.all. Thank you for watching. If this video was helpful and beneficial, please leave a like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you have any other confusions in JavaScript or even C#. Thank you and see you next time.